On the morning of December 15th, 1995, a woman named Shelly Markley put her 8-year-old son on the school bus, just like she did every single weekday. It was cold. It was unremarkable. By 8:30 that morning, nothing about this day suggested it would be any different from the thousands of mornings before it. By 3:30 that afternoon, she and her husband had vanished. Not gone for a few hours, vanished. Not didn't answer the phone, vanished. Gone, along with their truck, leaving behind an open safe, an unlocked gun cabinet, a lit coffee pot, and a husband's wristwatch sitting on a shelf, which is strange because by every account, that watch never left his wrist. For the next 30 years, investigators, journalists, podcasters, and amateur sleuths have tried to answer one question: what actually happened inside that house? And here's the thing, almost everyone who's told this story lands on the same explanation, almost by default. Grief made them run. They'd been through hell. They needed to disappear for a while. It's the tidy, emotionally satisfying answer. I want to show you why that answer doesn't survive contact with the evidence, and I want to walk you through what actually does fit, because when you lay the physical facts of this case next to each other, in order, a very different and much more disturbing picture starts to take shape. This is the case of John and Shelly Markley. Let's start exactly where the investigation started. Not with theories, but with a room. The Markleys lived on Greenville Road, a rural stretch outside Bristolville, Ohio, with their 5 kids: Ruthie, Stacy, Bonnie, Crystal, and Johnny, ranging from 8 to 15 years old. John was 36, an independent truck driver. Shelly was 32, a stay-at-home mother, who, by every account from people who knew her, was almost pathologically reliable. If she had to leave the house before the kids got home from school, she left a note. Every time, no exceptions. On December 15th, there was no note. When the kids walked in that afternoon, the front door was unlocked. That alone wasn't unusual for a rural Ohio household in 1995. What was unusual was everything else.
The coffee pot was still on, left running long enough that it had nearly burned dry. Now, hold that detail for a second, because we're going to come back to it. A coffee pot left on for hours implies a fast departure, somebody who left and never thought to come back and turn it off, or never got the chance. On a shelf above the stove sat John's wristwatch. By every family account, John wore that watch constantly. It wasn't sitting there because he forgot it on his way out the door for a routine errand. People who never take something off don't suddenly take it off and place it somewhere deliberate, unless something interrupts their routine. On the kitchen counter, Shelly's purse, her cigarettes, and her lighter. She smoked roughly a pack a day. If you've ever known a daily smoker, you know that their cigarettes function less like an accessory and more like a body part. You don't accidentally leave your cigarettes behind when you step out for 20 minutes. You leave them behind when you're not planning the trip at all, or when whatever's happening doesn't give you time to grab them.
So far, we have 3 small, almost forgettable details: a coffee pot, a watch, a pack of cigarettes. Individually, none of them mean anything. You could explain any one of them away. But evidence in a case like this doesn't work item by item. It works as a pattern. And the pattern, so far, says, these 2 people left in a hurry, and they did not expect to be gone long. Now go upstairs with the kids. The gun cabinet, which John kept locked at all times, a hard rule in that house, was standing open. Nobody in the family could say for certain what guns John owned or how many, so to this day nobody can confirm whether anything was taken. But an open gun cabinet and a house where the gun cabinet is never, ever open is not nothing. In the master bedroom, a small safe sat open. Birth certificates and other important documents were scattered across the dresser and the floor, the way papers end up scattered when someone is digging through them quickly, not when someone is calmly retrieving something they need. And in the garage, this is the detail that, for me, is the hardest one to explain away. The tarps that always covered John's 1978 Corvette were gone. Multiple family members independently confirmed the same fact. John never left that car uncovered. Not overnight, not for an afternoon.
Those tarps mattered to him in a way that borders on ritual. They weren't in the garage anymore. We'll find out exactly where they ended up, and it raises more questions than it answers.
So, stack it all up. A house left unlocked, a pot left brewing, a watch removed and placed somewhere deliberate, cigarettes and a lighter abandoned, a locked gun cabinet standing open, a safe rifled through, and car tarps, specifically in only those tarps, missing from the garage. This is not the profile of two people calmly packing a bag and driving off to start a new life. This is the profile of two people whose normal Friday was interrupted by something, and interrupted hard enough that neither of them stopped to grab a watch, a lighter, or close a safe. Keep that word in your head. Interrupted. We're going to test it against every theory that follows.
To understand why this looked at first like a voluntary disappearance, you need to understand what the Markleys had just survived. 2.5 years earlier, on July 4th, 1993, their home burned down. A year after that, almost to the day, John's father died. A few months later, John's nephew took his own life. And 2 days before John and Shelly vanished, John's twin sister Bonnie, who he had spent years trying to save, including raising $15,000 so she could pursue experimental cancer treatment in Mexico, finally lost her battle with the disease. John, by his own sister Linda's account, was furious in the days after Bonnie's death. He blamed doctors, he blamed God, he blamed everybody he could find to blame. But Linda also said something important. The day after Bonnie died, John seemed okay, stable, like a man absorbing a blow rather than a man about to unravel.
This matters because it's the foundation of the leading theory investigators floated early on, that John and Shelly, crushed under the cumulative weight of fire, death, suicide, and now this, simply needed to disappear, take a breath, get away from a life that had become unbearable. It's a theory built entirely on emotional plausibility and almost no physical evidence, and the people closest to John and Shelly rejected it immediately and without hesitation. Their relatives didn't hedge on this point. They said flatly that John and Shelly would never leave their children unattended, that the 5 kids were the center of their entire world. Full stop. Here's where Veritasium brain kicks in, because this is exactly the kind of claim you should be suspicious of in either direction. Grieving family members insisting they'd never do that is exactly what grieving family members say even when it's not true. So let's not take their word for it. Let's check it against the evidence we already gathered.
If John and Shelly planned to leave, even temporarily, even just to clear their heads, you'd expect at least some signs of preparation. A bag packed, clothes pulled together, cash withdrawn calmly in advance, maybe a note, even a vague one. Instead, we have the opposite of preparation. A watch left behind, cigarettes left behind, a coffee pot left running. None of those details serve a person who is leaving on purpose. They serve a person who is leaving because something forced them to. So they ran away from their grief theory has a problem before we even get to the truck, the bank, or the stranger in the passenger seat. It explains motive. It does not explain physical evidence. And in any investigation, physical evidence outranks motive every time, because motive tells you why someone might act. Evidence tells you what someone actually did.
Now let's go to the only verified sighting of John and Shelly Markley after they left their children that morning, and the single most important 60 seconds of this entire case. At 10:36 a.m., a teller working the drive-through window at a Bank One branch in Bloomfield, Ohio, about 5 miles from the Markley home, watched a red and silver pickup truck pull up. She recognized it immediately. The Markleys were regulars. John was driving. Shelly was sitting in the middle of the bench seat. And next to her, in the passenger seat, was a man the teller had never seen before in her life. Shelly signed a check, $1,000, made out to cash. She handed it through the window. The teller counted out the cash, handed it back, and watched the truck pull away.
That transaction left exactly $865 in the Markleys' checking account, and as far as anyone has ever been able to determine, it is the last confirmed financial transaction either of them ever made. Now think about what's sitting inside that 60-second window. 2 hours after their youngest kid got on the school bus, John and Shelly are alive, mobile, apparently functional enough to drive to a bank and conduct a transaction, and they are not alone. There is a third person physically wedged between them on the seat of their own truck. The teller couldn't describe him, couldn't pick him out of anything. To this day, 30 years later, nobody has ever identified that man.
I want you to sit with how strange this is, because most missing person stories don't have a clean, verified midpoint like this. Most disappearances are guesswork stitched together after the fact. This case has an actual, dated, time-stamped data point. At 10:36 a.m., 2 people who would never be seen again were captured alive by a credible eyewitness, sitting next to a man whose identity is the single biggest unanswered question in the entire investigation. Was he a friend? A coworker? Family didn't recognize the description, vague as it was. Was he someone who forced his way into that truck before 10:36, meaning the interruption we talked about earlier happened at the house, not after? Or did the Markleys pick him up willingly, meaning whatever happened with at least some degree of their cooperation, at least up to that point? Every theory in this case has to pass through that truck window. None of them do so cleanly. Within days, investigators found the Markleys' pickup truck. It was sitting locked and abandoned in a hardware store parking lot on Elm Road, roughly 10 miles from the Markley home, and notably that's further from home than the bank, in the opposite general direction of where you'd expect a quick errand to end. The truck was covered in mud, because John was meticulous about that truck. Multiple family members described him as the kind of man who kept his vehicles spotless as a point of pride. A muddy Markley truck was on its own a small anomaly. Combined with everything else, it's another thread in the same pattern. Something about this day broke every single one of John's normal habits, all at once.
Inside the cab, investigators found the family's cell phone. In 1995, still enough of a rarity that leaving it behind matters. In the bed of the truck, they found something almost throwaway in most retellings of this case, but worth pausing on: a tire for a semi-trailer truck. And the missing tarps from John's Corvette, the ones we flagged back in the garage, were sitting right there in the truck bed too. So here's a question almost nobody asks out loud. Why would anyone drive 10 miles out of their way, off-road, through mud, carrying car tarps and a spare semi-tire, only to abandon the truck in a random parking lot and lock it?
If you're trying to disappear voluntarily, you don't lock your truck in a public parking lot 10 miles from home with your cell phone sitting inside it. Locking a vehicle is an act of someone trying to protect or conceal what's inside it, or simply an act of habit performed without thinking. But either way, it implies someone made a deliberate choice about what to do with that truck after it had served its purpose. If you're the victim of foul play, you don't typically end up driving the getaway vehicle yourself off-road, then conveniently park it somewhere it'll be found within days. The truck sits at the exact intersection of every theory in this case, and it doesn't resolve cleanly into any of them. It's the strongest physical evidence we have, and it's also the most stubbornly ambiguous. What followed was one of the largest search efforts rural Trumbull County had seen. Roughly 100 local volunteers combed hundreds of acres of land surrounding the Markley property. Police ran an air search. Divers went into Mosquito Lake, Lake Milton, and the quarry at Nelson Ledges, all bodies of water within reach of where the truck was found. Nothing. No remains, no clothing, no physical trace of either Markley anywhere. In an investigation like this, a thorough search that finds absolutely nothing is itself a data point, and it's worth treating it like one instead of just an unfortunate dead end. It tells you that whatever happened to John and Shelly likely didn't happen in the immediate searchable radius around their home or their truck, or if it did, whoever was responsible was careful enough,
or lucky enough, to make sure nothing surfaced. That's a meaningfully different scenario than two grieving parents drove off into the sunset. People who voluntarily disappear usually turn up eventually. A sighting, a credit card charge, a tip from somewhere they resettled. Sheriff Tom Altier said as much himself years into the investigation, stating plainly that his gut told him they were dead, because if they'd been alive anywhere, some trace, a receipt, a transaction, anything would eventually have surfaced. Decades on, nothing ever did. About a year into the investigation, the case took a turn that, for a moment, looked like it might crack everything open. A man named Stephen Durst, a former employee of John's, contacted the Markley family directly. His claim, he was holding John and Shelly, and he wanted money for their safe return. Reports vary on the exact figure, somewhere between $10,000 and $100,000, but the demand itself was unambiguous. The family did the right thing. They went straight to police, who arranged a sting at a gas station. Durst showed up expecting a bag of cash. He was handed a bag of rags and arrested on the spot. Here's where the case gets genuinely strange, though, because Durst's polygraph results came back flagging several of his answers about John and Shelly's actual disappearance as deceptive. That's the kind of detail that, in most true crime stories, would be the smoking gun. And for a while, investigators leaned into it. A year after the disappearance, the lead investigator on the case stated outright that she believed Durst knew exactly what happened to the Markleys and simply wasn't talking, pointing to the fact that he'd been out of work at the time and had reportedly told people the Markleys owed him money. But, and this is important, the sheriff overseeing the broader case ultimately concluded there wasn't enough to connect Durst to the actual disappearance. He was convicted of extortion, 4 to 10 years in prison. He has denied any involvement in whatever happened to John and Shelly ever since, and he has never been charged in connection to the disappearance itself. So, what do we actually have here? A man with a financial grudge, a documented willingness to exploit the situation for cash, and deceptive polygraph results about a missing couple, who was nonetheless never tied to their disappearance by any physical evidence. This is a case where I think it's worth being honest about what a suspect actually means in an unsolved investigation. Durst proved beyond any doubt that he was willing to profit from John and Shelly's disappearance. That is not the same as proving he caused it. Plenty of opportunists circle a tragedy without having created it. The most likely read, based on everything investigators eventually said publicly, is that Durst was exactly what he claimed during his own confession to the extortion scheme, a man capitalizing on a vanishing he had no real hand in, who may have simply been a bad liar about unrelated things on a polygraph that isn't even reliably accurate to begin with. For most of 2 decades, the case went cold. Then in 2015, the sheriff announced new leads. Some recent interviews, he said, without detailing who or what. He used the word roadblock. It's the kind of update that tells you almost nothing concrete, and yet tells you the case never fully died on a desk somewhere. Then in 2020, something happened that, on its surface, has nothing to do with John and Shelly Markley at all. A 71-year-old local man named Milton Kurtzman was arrested for shooting his roommate. He died in jail of natural causes not long after. And then, investigators showed up at his property and conducted an extensive search and refused to say what they were looking for. One official wouldn't confirm whether they were searching for human remains or stolen property. Another, a different Trumbull County sheriff, said only that they were hoping to find something connected to a cold case that, in his words, dated back roughly 20 years. 20 years before 2020 puts you almost exactly at 1995. Nobody in law enforcement has ever publicly confirmed that this search was connected to the Markleys. Nobody has denied it either. And since that search, there has been no public follow-up of any kind, no statement on what, if anything, was found, no update on whether Kurtzman had any connection to John or Shelly at all. That kind of silence is its own kind of evidence. Either the search turned up nothing and investigators saw no reason to publicly clear a dead man's name in a case he'd likely had nothing to do with, or it turned up something that simply hasn't been disclosed, possibly because the case remains technically open and any future charges depend on what wasn't said. So, let's go back to where we started. The theory that John and Shelly simply ran from their grief, and let's finish testing it. It cannot explain the watch. It cannot explain the cigarettes. It cannot explain a coffee pot left brewing for hours. It cannot explain an open gun cabinet in a house where that cabinet is never open. It cannot explain a locked truck 10 miles in the wrong direction, packed with tarps and a spare tire, abandoned with a cell phone inside it, and it absolutely cannot explain an unidentified man sitting between them on a bank drive-through bench seat 2 hours after their kids left for school. What does fit all of that? Something interrupted an ordinary Friday morning, fast enough that neither of them had time to grab the smallest, most habitual items of their daily lives. Whatever it was, it didn't stop them from being mobile and apparently cooperative enough to drive to a bank and withdraw cash 3 hours later, in the company of someone nobody can identify. That's not a story about two parents choosing to leave. That's a story about two parents whose choices by 10:36 that morning may not have been entirely their own anymore. We don't get a clean answer here. Nobody does, in this case. No body has ever been found. No confession has ever held up. The man in the truck has never been identified in 30 years, despite a teller looking directly at his face. What we do have is a scene that, item by item, only makes sense as an interruption, and a 30-year silence that has swallowed every lead that's ever tried to explain it. If you know anything about what happened to John and Shelly Markley on December 15, 1995, the Trumbull County Sheriff's Office still wants to hear from you. Their case is still open. Somewhere, there's a person who knows who was sitting in that truck, and as of right now, that person has stayed quiet for 3 decades.